I think we've got to go to kind of the flip to China,
Yeah.
right? Because I think similar, if you listen to Aggie Allstars, my dad had a similar path, and yours, there's a Venn diagram here of your and his path on the Chinese experience. But how does a kid from Victoria, BC end up in Beijing?
I blame it all on one individual, and his name happens to be Len Hawkins. And you know Len very well. And I had the great fortune to work with your dad for a number of years prior to your dad going to China, your dad and mom going to China. And I remember the day that the announcement was made that Len was leaving Advanta, and him and Jan were going to relocate to China, and I went like, who does that? Like, I mean, that was just way out in left field. And, you know, I could just see the excitement, hear it in his voice, etc. And of course, Lennon's style was not somebody to all this rah-rah stuff. I mean, he just chuckled and laughed and you know, but you could see that it was a big opportunity for him. So Len goes to China, and you know, of course, we lose touch a little bit, you know, just from distance and doing something different. And we weren't as active on these sorts of apparatuses during that period of time either. I think you can appreciate that.
Yeah, with the
You know,
DOS era.
yeah. No,
Yeah,
if we were gonna do a face-to-face virtual call, we were going down to a business somewhere else that had cameras set up, and you know you do it that way. So time and distance, you know, created a void in there for us. But you know, anyways, that continued on. I had a change of direction in terms of where I was working, and Len had asked me once before that. He says, "Would I ever consider going to China?" And I said, "Well, probably not. I mean, you know, I have a really good job. I was still living in an era where I felt quite committed to
yeah,
my employer. Again, I had combined services before I went to China, 24 plus years, and you know, I just had that adage that, you know, you just don't walk out because of a new opportunity.
right.
Then I got walked out, and you know, I was in a different time and different space. And I
Yeah,
remember Len asked me, phoning me and say, "Well, maybe times have changed for you, Dave. You know, is this something you might want to consider?" So my philosophy changed, Rhett, about, you know, maybe I need to be more concerned about number one rather than the organization, because, you know, you need to be in control of your own life, not having somebody else do it. So that was a life lesson with Advanta. And even though I was really enjoying what I was doing with the Agritain group, working internationally was something that I always thought would be very, very intriguing and very interesting. And I thought, when he phoned and asked me, he said, "Would I at least let my name stand?" And you know, I thought about it for a bit, you know, not long, but I said, "Yeah, I think I'd be interested in going to the next steps." Never really appreciating that I would probably meet the criteria, etc. So, you know, even Gail, my wife, she just kind of, yeah, nodded her head and yeah, sure, go for the interview. Probably, you know, thinking much the same. This isn't going to go anywhere. But lo and behold, did the interviews and did all the due processes and was offered the job. And that was very thrilling. Probably one of the biggest thrills I ever had in my life was being offered that job.
yeah,
So I know, you know, one of the major changes is if relocating to another country, another culture is
yeah.
not just about me, it's about the family.
Yes.
And so by
How
now
how old was the family at that time?
we had two daughters, one near the completion of high school, the other one was already engaged in the University of Manitoba with her ag degree.
Okay.
And so, you know, having the conversation with Gail was a lot different now than it was before, because she really didn't think it would happen. Our girls were very supportive of the concept. Gail was less thrilled about it, to be honest with you. And understanding, again, I learned more when we finally got to China. But you know, I was so hyped up on the opportunity, the challenge, you know, all the deal that would go with this. You know, I mean, even for my own career advancement, I thought this was real
Yeah.
good. But what's really tough for the family, especially the spouses, is that, they give up the dog, they give up the house, they give up their friends, they give up, their ability to function in their own comfort zone.
Yeah.
And I wasn't really worried about that, to be honest with you. But the girls did a good job of convincing Gail that this was good for us as a family, and so she finally relented and agreed. And so we took an early trip to visit with your dad and mom, and before I actually signed on the dotted line, and we went across to take a look at what Beijing was, because
Yeah.
I was really prepared for this, as you can appreciate.
Yeah.
I knew nothing of cotton. I knew nothing of China, right? And so, there was a lot of ribbing that went on this side of the border. People saying, well, they must have picked the right guy. He doesn't know anything about anything. So,
Yeah.
um,
That's the right guy.
they got the right guy. But, some wise man named Len Hawkins also said, Dave, the seed business. And he says, like that, all that information is quite transferable, and
Yeah.
people, and you'll learn about that. So, we started into our journey, and what became problematic almost right after we signed the agreement is that we were planning for a January departure, and then
Mhm.
this thing called SARS. In fact, when we were over visiting, we were one of the last Air Canada flights leaving China before travel was stopped completely in and out of Asia, or in and out of China at that time. And so I did all my onboarding and training in St. Mary's. I was down
Yeah.
in Scott, Mississippi, and back and forth, and certainly it was an interesting time. Again, we go back to virtual meetings, and your dad and I were hiring people for the Beijing office, and people I've never met, and circumstances I had no concept of, but we were organizing ourselves through virtual meetings, through commercial and centers that would allow for
Yeah.
that to happen, and attending board meetings with our Chinese partners. So by June, July, things were clearing up, and so we packed up our suitcases and turned the keys for our house over to our daughter and her girlfriend that moved in with her in Winnipeg, and my wife and youngest daughter, Adrian. We relocated to Beijing to start on our journey, which was going to be 2 years. That was my agreement, 2 years. So I was
Yeah.
there, it seemed like weeks, or maybe it was months, maybe a bit more. But the gentleman who was running the international business, Ken Faraday, asked me if I would maybe tag on another year.
Mhm.
And I said, I didn't even hesitate. I said, absolutely.
Yeah.
And by the end of year three, then there was now further discussions about mergers or an acquisition. And so the company provided some incentives to keep us there a little bit longer. And so it lasted, a little more than 5 years, pushing into six by the time that came to a conclusion, and we relocated back to Winnipeg. But it was an interesting dialogue, getting everybody on board with all the rest of it. Best thing I ever did. I've had I've spoken on the subject a lot of times, and I've coached a lot of people, and in terms of, if an opportunity ever comes to work internationally, I don't care where it is, you want to go,
Yeah.
you want to do it. And you're a living memory or a living example of that right yourself. I mean, you took a risk and moved family and your career south of the border. Your brother he's lived in more places than any of us even probably visited. And it served him very, very well. And living
Yeah.
living and working within an expat community in such a country as China, you start to appreciate that this is a pretty neat deal, right? I mean, and the opportunities that are there was amazing. So I've been a big proponent of international assignments, for whatever reason, for whatever length of time.
Now, what would your I don't want to put words in your
Mhm.
mouth, but what would your family say? Obviously, you actually moved with Gail and your youngest
Yeah.
daughter there. I didn't know that your youngest daughter came with you. Would they say, like, what was it like then? I know any transition's tough, but would they look back on that and go, we would do it again in a heartbeat?
That's an interesting question. I'm pretty much sure my daughter would, Adrian would, and our oldest daughter, who was back and forth on many trips, was actually engaged on the Great Wall of China, which was all pretty cool. Gail was an amazing trooper during our time period over there. She embraced the culture Probably much more than many do. I mean, she was doing her Tai Chi. She learned the language, which was
Yeah.
impressive. You know, we could, which made it so much easier for her, and it made it easier for us because we could travel, we could do many things on our own without, always having somebody else tagging along behind us that, be it staff or translators or,
Yeah.
tour groups even. I mean, we shied away from those and had our own tours. But I think that first off, if you go back to China, is not
Yeah.
China today that I lived in or that we lived in or what Len
Right.
lived in. It is a very, very different place. It is, I'm not so sure I would be as eager to go back today.
Yeah.
I was very sad to leave.
Yeah.
It took me a while to readjust to
Yeah.
Canadian life. There's culture shock going both ways.
Yep.
And I was not prepared for either side.
Yeah.
And it was difficult. I went through a couple tough months on this side when I came back.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
it and life is so slow here. I mean, compared to what life was over there, like it
Oh,
was, yeah, yeah. So
at least no one was, well, I don't know. We might need to cut this, but spitting on your feet when you walk down the road, that doesn't happen in Winnipeg.
I was in awe every day. I learned something new every day, and things that I never would have learned here. I mean, it's a different world, and it it was exciting to live and work in a different culture. And I mean, and the cultures are 180 degrees from west to east,
Yep.
and nobody properly prepares themselves for that. And their companies can do a much better job of preparing people. Used to watch the fellows and ladies come in from the USDA, and they'd go and
Yeah.
do an extensive language training for years before they would put them over into positions. But business is not Western business and Eastern business is very, very different. And it takes you a couple of years to understand that, appreciate that, and learn to work with that. And I think as a rule, as Canadians and based on the culture we have here, we have the ability to be pretty open-minded about what
Yeah.
what and how we act in other parts of the world. And I've had conversations like this with your brother, and he's just a natural at adapt, and boy, he's had to adapt. I mean, so,
Yeah.
but again, there's so much to learn from somebody like Stephen who has really been in multiple cultures, right? I mean, but it is so important for people in business to have a firm understanding of really what that is. You can't do business as you did at home. Like it doesn't happen.
Well, I think that's where, and I know we have some American listeners as well, and I'm a dual citizen proudly, but I think it's also why you see Canadians do well in a lot of these positions, right? Because we're more apt to, like you said, you're introverted by nature. Canadians are little, I'm going to
Yeah,
listen first, figure out, I'm going to do things maybe on your cultural terms first, and then we blend in, right? So, a very Canadian thing, which does work well internationally,
it
as
does.
you have
Yeah,
experience of.
yeah, yeah. I would. So I'm again. I wouldn't have learned the value of that sitting in Winnipeg or Saskatoon or Calgary. I just those that was why one of the learnings that I took back. I mean it was exciting. It was and. Again, I would coach anybody and encourage people to get outside your comfort zone.
Yeah, well, that's the big lesson. And who's kidding who? You did it early on, which is probably why it was
Yeah.
innate to you. From the island to Saskatchewan to Winnipeg to China. I mean, it seems like bold moves, but and they are, but it's a matter of there's a trend here,
Yeah.
right? Each allowed you to kind of go to the next step. And who's kidding who? If Steve hadn't moved to the States or Len to China, who knows if I would have been more confident to do the same sort of thing. But the US isn't China for a move. So,
No, no,
but
no, 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 no. Absolutely. Yeah.
they speak the same language here. So I got to ask before we move on to likely like the biggest moments of your career with Cantera Seeds, but we got to have a banquet or Baijiu story from China. There's got to be something. What were your tricks to get through
Well,
those times?
Your dad picked up the tricks quicker than I did, because he's a smarter guy than I am, and I knew that a little bit like moving to Winnipeg is that you start to quickly realize like if you indulge as much as they want you to do, you're gonna be dead. And again, the whole world of alcohol has made some drastic changes in China compared to where it was when we were there. So I was more on the tail end of it all, but it was simply, I mean, it was still very, very real. But I was able to negotiate the fact that this 40, 50, 60, 70% sorghum based alcohol called Baijiu is, man, I'll tell you, I just couldn't see how my liver was going to sustain
Yeah.
that. So I would start my banquets by negotiating beer to Baijiu. And
Wow.
so that was my saving grace is that, I'd rather be drinking 4% alcohol or 5% alcohol. And it was more of a bloating problem than it was the Baijiu problem. So it reminded me of my early days in the grain business. We're really that socializing and the alcohol was a part of the culture. That's gone away a long time ago here in North America.
Yeah.
And if you went to China today, that it is shied upon, the drinking. It has changed a lot. And the stats really,
Yeah.
I mean, the sorghum producers or the Baijiu producers of their production is way down from where it used to be. So government people are now disallowed from drinking and during banquets.
Banquets.
Yeah, so but the banquet itself was, I mean, the rules and laws again,
Yeah.
your dad helped coach and train me for that because, and it sounds kind of silly, but in the culture where food and people are really important and simply the simple setting of a round table versus a square table where you can look
Yeah.
at every single individual in the eye without moving, like I mean, so to speak, you turn your head.
Yeah.
If you're sitting at a square table or a banquet table as we're accustomed to in this part of the world, you don't have that connection where you can connect with everybody around a round table. And I found it fascinating. And I really wish my language skills had been as good as my wife's, but having very competent people that would help me and on the communication side. But
Yeah.
it was a great experience. I will not tell you I walked out of every meeting and could drive home because one, I wasn't allowed to drive, and secondly, I couldn't find the car. But
Yeah.
I may have embarrassed myself once or twice, but as I learned, I didn't embarrass myself. I was actually showing good
Really.
face with our host. So thank God.
Yes. Well, I think it just goes to show, I don't think people will wonder. I've sat in those. For you to have negotiated and actually like won the negotiation to go beer for Baijiu, I think we need to put you at the trade
Yeah,
desk right now.
yeah.
You could solve a lot of things. That's impressive.